Let's start that early. The way we thought about this particular event was that an awful lot of discussions about science religion occur around what Paul referred to a bit ago as the big ideas. Cosmology, evolution, God. Here's a big idea. And those are important questions and important areas for discussion. What often doesn't get addressed are what are smaller questions, but maybe just as, if not even more important questions, and that is, how does the interaction of science and the Christian faith play itself out in terms of our own personal lives as Christians, or our corporate lives as members of a Christian community, particularly a local Christian community of a congregation? And when I think about that in terms of three areas, namely worship, which is a time when the whole community comes together, or can be thought of in terms of those moments of personal religious devotion that individuals practice. Secondly, the kind of educational life of the church. Most churches that we have the association with have Sunday school programs for children and also for adults, as well as professional educational preparation, which Paul had made allusion to in terms of preparing clergy for and then thirdly, the church's mission in the world. To what extent developments in science and technology bear upon how we as individual Christians think about our vocation in the world, and how do we think about our collective vocation as the church in the world. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation about that, rather than big, deep theological questions. We may wander into that territory as well, but I thought the kind of practical, pragmatic sorts of things would be an interesting place to start, because it's a subject matter that I don't find a lot of conversation about. Anyhow, that was my idea about conversation.
So, for this, I'm going to rely very much on Jim to keep me on track, because I'm easily distracted. Bright, shiny objects catch my attention, and I go off in different directions. But I'm particularly happy to be involved in a conversation like this, because from time to time, I give talks about science and religion. And in the process of doing that, I usually give very short shrift to exactly the kinds of questions that Jim has identified. One of the ways in which I dismiss such questions is in thinking about the kinds of questions that science addresses and the kind of questions that religion addresses. And when I talk about this, I specifically do it to deny the idea that these are completely separate, as some people have said, non-overlapping magisteria. I don't believe that. I believe that there are indeed things where you must bring to bear your understandings from science and your understandings from religion if you're going to do a good job of addressing the questions. I think that falls into the category of the kinds of things that Jim's been talking about. And that's about all I ever say about it. Now, I don't think that these are completely separate disciplines that never have anything to do with each other, that there are overlap areas, and then I go on to something else. And I think that it's just such overlap areas where, in a sense, the rubber hits the road. This is where our faith as Christians influences the way in which societal questions are addressed, and where our understandings from science, either as scientists or as consumers of the science that is financed by our tax dollars, because most of science is financed by our tax dollars, at least at the basic science level, putting those things together.
One of the things that strikes me at the corporate level of the interaction of these things in terms of local congregations is at the point of worship. I don't know how many of you wince when you sing a hymn that is clearly a three-story universe hymn in which the sun revolves around the earth.
God who spins the twirling planets.
I don't know about the Methodist, the most recent Methodist hymn book, but amongst Presbyterians, there probably are a handful of hymns that even by implication reflect any sense of the scope of the creation as we've discovered over the last 400 or 500 years. On the one hand, it seems to me, one can ask the question, well, so what about the size of God's creation? On the other hand, the size of it is actually pretty impressive if you're talking about God's creator. And wouldn't it really be interesting in terms of hymns of praise and that sort of thing, that part of what we acknowledged was something not only of its size, but of its diversity and its J.B.S. Haldane, who was one of the founders of modern evolutionary theory, had this wonderful line. He said, God must have an inordinate love of beetles because he made so many different kinds of them. There is something about the plethora of creatures that seems to suggest a delight in God for that kind of variety. And yet it's seldom that we will sing about that in church. We'll sing about fairest Lord Jesus, but we won't sing about this wonderful, diverse creation that we find, that we've only just begun to discover. It amazes me that it's only within the last 100 years we actually knew there were other galaxies. Back in the 1920s, they were still debating whether or not there were galaxies other than the Milky Way.
Well, I guess that perhaps I'm a little bit more forgiving about the hymnology that I encounter in the Methodist Church. Perhaps it's one of those things where one automatically reinterprets the text in in modern terms. But nevertheless, I want to pick up on this idea about the way in which our understandings of science can influence our understandings of worship. And certainly you touched on a very important part, the grandeur of God's universe is, when you study it scientifically, is almost unimaginable. If you really appreciate what the size of the universe is, what the age of the universe is, and what has happened since the beginning of the universe, it's just astounding. Far more astounding to my way of thinking than the admittedly beautifully poetic description of the creation that we find in the first chapter of Genesis, and the wonderfully personal description of creation that we find in the second chapter of Genesis. And I strongly believe that we were given those descriptions as a gift to deepen our understanding of the ways in which God acts through creation and acts still today in our daily lives. It may surprise you to hear that a scientist who puts a great deal of stock in cosmology and the creation of the universe at the Big Bang and the development of both the cosmos and the life that exists within it that we know about in a very tiny corner of that cosmos, that I have a hard time reading the first couple of verses of Genesis without crying. It's just so beautiful. But I'd also like to add a smaller dimension. One of my favorite hymns is For the Beauty of the Earth. And oddly, I was just thinking about that hymn today as I was driving out, in the admittedly a little bit muted explosion of color that we get every fall. This year isn't quite as brilliant, but I passed by this one tree and I thought, wow, what an incredibly beautiful exhibition of what God does on a regular basis in our universe. And I know why the seasons occur, but still I give God credit for making for us. And here's this funny thought process that I have, for making for something for us, or making us in a way that we appreciate the beauty of these things. It seems to me it didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that we would look at a tree that is bursting with reds and yellows and the greens are still there and think, wow, what a beautiful tree. what a beautiful experience to look at that thing. It doesn't seem to me that it had to be that way. And I thank God for the fact that we are made that way. And then I was thinking the following. I don't know, are you familiar with the hymn For the Beauty of the Earth? Is this okay. Well, one of the verses goes, for the joy of ear and eye, for the heart and mind's delight, for the mystic harmony, linking sense to sound and sight. Isn't it amazing that we experience these things and take them in and process them in a way that we experience beauty and joy? How does that happen? You know, nobody has a clue how that happens. But as we study more and more about brain function, about neuroscience, we're starting to get glimpses, you know, of how this happens. And what a wonderful gift we have. When I was interviewed shortly after receiving the Nobel Prize, people were asking me about my views about science and religion. And one of the things I said was that I was so grateful that God had given us such an interesting place to explore. Now, this may not be something that will strike the average Christian as a really important part of God's gift. But when you're a scientist, the fact that the world is so interesting is just really, really cool. I mean, it gets you up in the morning and says, I gotta get in the lab because there's more new stuff to find out about.
You're gonna make you put up with government.
Yeah, so even when they keep you away for 3 weeks, you know, you keep... And, you know, again, did it have to be that way? You know, I mean, every time we peel back a layer of nature's secrets, there's something else that's so beautiful and explosively wonderful. And did it have to be that way? It's hard for me to escape the idea that God did this because he knew there was going to be this small cadre of people called scientists who were going to get a really big kick out of it. And of course, there's all these other things that so many other people get a kick out of. And I often think, you know, that I feel so blessed to be a scientist because I can see these portions of God's creation that are so wonderful. This is getting to the worship aspects, isn't it? Because for me, doing science is an act of worship. Because what I'm doing is learning about what God has given us. And I'm so thankful that I've had that opportunity. But I hasten to admit that that's just one aspect of the way in which we can appreciate God's creation. There are people who have other kinds of talents that are far different than mine, who appreciate other aspects of God's creation in ways that I cannot. I mean, think about the way a painter appreciates the kind of beauty that continually unfolds as the seasons change. There must be something wonderful about being able to perceive the ways in which light and color change that escapes a physicist, you know, who thinks of it, you know, in terms of spectrophotometry or something. But to think of it in the poetic way that a painter would think of it. Or, you know, when you go into the woods and you hear the music of the birds and the insects that are at home there in the woods, and how much more beautiful and more deep must be the appreciation of a musician who is listening to that kind of music. And I think, yes, okay, it's not like I'm the only one who gets to have this little insight into a particular corner of God's creation. Everybody has a particular skill at appreciating what God gives us. And I think that sometimes we neglect in worship those kinds of gifts. And you know, every time I walk into church and I see that the opening hymn is going to be "For the Beauty of the Earth," which happens maybe once a year, yes. Because it is, it's just, Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of thankful praise. I don't think we do that enough.
I don't want to go beyond that. That was really terrific. As an occasional preacher, one of the things that I remember about a worship service that I went to in Raleigh, North Carolina in July of 1969. First Church, Raleigh, is, by all Presbyterian accounts, a high steeple church. And sufficiently high that it had a Scottish minister who spoke with a wonderful brogue. The hymns were classical, Protestant Reformed hymns. A wonderful choir, big organ, just a terrific service. But I left it really troubled. And the reason was, the previous week, two Americans, one of whom was, as a matter of fact, a Presbyterian elder, had walked on the face of the moon. And it was not mentioned in the entire service. Only recently I discovered that it was Karl Barth who said that preachers need to preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Well, certainly that was in the newspaper. And yet the fact that wasn't, it wasn't even in the announcements, let alone in the prayer, the corporate prayer, or even mentioned in the process of the sermon for that day, for me reflected this notion of non-overlapping magisterium, which I do think is false, but is false not because it isn't practiced by a lot of people. That is to say that some, to a significant degree, we in the church, in worship is a good example of this, will speak and use images that while they reflect biblical cosmology, will not, as a matter of fact, be consonant with what we've actually learned about creation over these past several centuries. And it seems to me that part of what that does is it perpetuates this way of thinking about God disconnected from the kind of warp and woof of our own present cultural lives, and doesn't encourage us to reflect on what it means for us to live in worshipful sorts of ways, to live in the context of the world that we discover God is giving us around us, or calling into being around us. Now, another area of church life is the area of Christian education, and I do know that there has been increasing numbers of opportunities, particularly within whatever form of adult education goes on in congregations, for various topics of science and religion to be able, for a period of time, subject matter for those sorts of things. And that's good. It's probably good, whenever that happens, that it be accompanied also by a somewhat deeper sense of what the actual tradition of the church is, too. Because part of what I discover is not only are often people in the church relatively innocent of science, they're often relatively innocent of the Christian tradition as well. And it is a rich tradition, but rich in some ways in the Chinese sense that you don't want to know how both laws and sausage are made, because that it may be not necessarily pleasant.
Or may you live in interesting times.
May you live in interesting times. That's right, I'm missing up my illusions. But I think it is the case that the actual history of science, for instance, is much more interesting in many respects than the stories we've told ourselves about scientists, certainly among scientists. So something like the Galileo case or the evolution controversy and so, but when you actually look at the history, it really is far more interesting than the way in which we've ordinarily told those stories. And likewise, the same thing is true about the ways in which our traditions have developed we actually have a tradition that has developed. That's itself a sort of revelation for folks. It didn't simply appear one day on the doorstep. Well, I'll make this allusion there. It didn't come down to us on golden tablets. I mean, it is a thing that has developed over time. And certainly within the Reformed tradition, there's been a recognition that you can never have a definitive, once and for all, declaration of the faith. That is always going to be required a reforming of that understanding, simply because circumstances change over time. And there's a need to be able to speak to those times and those places in ways that are genuine for them, which don't necessarily deny any other such declaration, but are authentic for that particular time and place. So for instance, I've often wondered what people think they are saying when they say the Nicene Creed and they say that the Father and the Son are made of the same substance. I mean, what would a physicist say about that? What is that substance?
Well, we're probably going to get to the thing that somehow or other we always end up with, that I'm a dualist, and you think that I'm hopelessly naive in my dualism, and that substance is spirit. But on the other hand, you talk about the Nicene Creed. There's a marvelous book which I think could only be loved by someone who is both a physicist and a theologian, by John Polkinghorne, called The Faith of a Physicist. And in this, he goes through the Nicene Creed and shows how, as a physicist, who also happens to be an Anglican priest, although he was a physicist first, he goes through how he can affirm his belief in each of the points of the Nicene Creed as a physicist. And it's a marvelous book, but, unless you have that bent, you might find it a bit tedious, but it's for a physicist, it was fantastic.
What I began this conversation about education talking about was about adult education. But the truth of the matter is that's not the only education that goes on like the church. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of emphasis made upon children's education, Sunday school, which gets probably somewhat rockier as it gets into the older grades and kids get into middle school and high school. One of the things that you cannot find, for the most part, is curriculum materials that in any way reflect what the kids are learning in their own experience in school about the world in a way that is congenial to and in some way coheres with what they're learning about their faith in school. While there has been materials that have been developed for adults in this area, there's almost nothing that you can find that really provides an opportunity for kids as they are coming along and learning about the world in their public education or private education for that matter, that fits in some way with what they're learning about God, God's creation, and their faith as Christians in the church.
Well, you're right, and when it comes to adult education, as you say, there are materials. I don't know how it is in this church, but in the church I go to, almost no adults actually come to the adult education. We were bemoaning the fact that, maybe it's because of what we're studying. Right now we're studying the prophets. And when you're studying Jeremiah and Ezekiel, maybe it's just not reaching some people. But, I don't know.
Jeremiah told the armies of Israel to desert in the face of the Babylonians. That's got to be interesting.
Well, I think so, but it's kind of hard to get people excited about Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Daniel. If you read the apocryphal stories of Daniel was a scientist. He was a great debunker of people who were basically trying to deceive the people, do you know the story about, because it's only in the Apocrypha. So this is an example of how easily distracted I am. So, this all happens during the Babylonian captivity, and Daniel is being exhorted to worship the local gods. He says, "No, I only worship. I worship the living God." And they said, "Well, our God is living. Look, we bring him sacrifices every evening, and in the morning they're gone. He consumes them." And Daniel says, "Why don't we investigate this a little bit more closely?" So he goes with them into the the temple area where this was going to happen. They lay out the bread that the god, I forget what his name was, who was going to consume these things, and then they close up the doors, and Daniel seals it with wax. Okay, but Daniel's clever. See, unbeknownst to the people who were going along with this thing, is he had scattered in the dust. He had scattered flour on the floor, and he goes out, seals the door with wax. They open the next morning. They open the thing is untouched seal, and they open the doors. The bread is gone. Then under closer examination, there are footprints all over the floor from the secret passageway that they had built for the priest to come and take the bread away. What a guy! Yeah, exactly. I mean, this guy's a real scientist. So, so I love these things, but it's really hard to get adults. I mean, this is a long way to get to a short story. It's really hard to get our adults to attend our adult education. We're looking if they pay attention to the sermon. But with the kids, it's a different story. And there, you're absolutely right. We don't have so many resources. I got a whole bunch of resources if we wanted to do science type stuff. My church isn't all that interested. But so what has happened in our church is every once in a while they'll call me in to talk to the Sunday school class. And I remember it wasn't that long ago, they were talking about Genesis, and they were talking about the Big Bang. I mean, this was just something that the Sunday school teachers were bringing up because they knew that was something the kids were going to confront. And they asked me to come in and talk about it. And as one of the things that I brought in a little boogie-woogie song that was written by Naomi Judd. Now, one of the odd things that's happened in my life is I've become kind of friendly with Naomi Judd. She overheard me talking with some kids about science and religion, and immediately made herself part of the conversation and told me she was in the process of writing this song about the Big Bang, and wanted some of my input into this. And she wrote this. She wrote the Big Bang Boogie. And you can get it. I'm even mentioned in the liner notes. This is about as big as a physicist ever gets. Being mentioned in the liner notes of
Country Western.
There you go. And she recorded it with her daughter Winona. And the reason that she did it was that she understood that in a sense, constituencies that she has as a country western singer is a constituency that has a lot of trouble with the perceived conflict between what the Bible says and what science tells us. And in this song, she explores the wonder and majesty of God and praises God for His creation in the Big Bang. And so I talked about how majestic this concept is, and how worthy of our praise and adulation the understanding of the Big Bang is. But it's developing materials. I mean, that's a challenge.
I want to we're get on time, and I really want to have a chance for you all to raise questions or make comments or whatever along the way. But I did want to touch on one other topic. It's a big one because it has to do, on the individual level, it has to do with sort of how we sense whatever we're doing in life as Christian vocation. And for many of us, or for some of us, that is working in science and being engaged in science, and how we understand that. And then secondly, is the church's own sense of its mission in a world in which we are deeply informed by the sciences about the circumstances of our life, and science-based technologies are actively transforming elements of our life in ways that it's even hard to predict what those consequences are going to be. And where's the church then, as it thinks about its call to be representative of and a builder of God's kingdom in the world, given that the world has this scientific and technological character to it, increasingly and globally. We talked a little bit about this over dinner, that one of those areas in which this conversation is taking place is around issues of environmental stewardship, where there seems for many people in various areas, various places on the theological spectrum, a shared interest in and concern about responsibility for human responsibility for being active stewards of the creation that God is giving us. I want to take an exception to that, but let me make a comment before I do.
Yeah, and as with most things, it reminds me of a story. So many years ago, I was teaching senior high kids Sunday school, and we were studying Genesis. And we get to the part where God says, "Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth." And one of the young girls in the class said, "Subdue the earth. Seems like maybe we've done a bit too good of a job of that." And this girl is now in her mid-40s, so you can imagine how long ago this was. She was thinking about pollution and those kinds of environmental things. Today, she's at least as concerned. She became an ecologist, by the way. She's at least concerned about global warming. We weren't thinking about climate change back then, as more than 30 years ago. That really hadn't come up on the radar screen. I mean, the more prescient scientists knew that something was going on, but most people didn't really have that as part of their understanding of an environmental challenge. But so she made this comment, and I said, "Okay, why don't we as a class put together a worship service about exactly that issue?" And we did. And but the challenges that we face, that she was so acutely aware of then, and which obviously was so important to her that it affected her career choice and the way in which she has played out her professional career. The challenges that we face today are far more severe than the challenges that we were facing then, or the challenges we knew we were facing then. One of my buddies in the scientific world is Steve Chu. He, up until a few months ago, he was the Secretary of Energy. One of his jobs was to worry about climate change and how we were going to respond to it, because climate change, as we have learned, has been mainly due to the way in which we have used energy, mainly in the form of fossil fuels, and so energy that was his responsibility. And even before he became Secretary of Energy, when he was the director of the Lawrence Berkeley laboratory, he was focusing on ways in which we could reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, so as to both improve the environment, but also to face the inevitable that there's only so much of fossil fuels. Now, the sad part is, the last talk I heard him give, the sad part of this is that our ability to squeeze more fossil fuel out of recalcitrant geological structures keeps getting better. So it doesn't seem that anytime in the near future that we're going to run out of fossil fuels and fix the problem of over-carbonizing the atmosphere because we can't find them. No, we can frack those things out of shale. We've just learned wonderful ways of getting things that even 10 years ago were simply not economical to extract from geological structures. So we're heading toward perdition. I mean, if we don't do something, we're in deep trouble. And some people think, well, God won't let that happen. What makes you think that? What makes you think that God won't let our, shall I use the term, sin, lead to our destruction? Is there any reason why we think that God won't allow our sin to lead to our destruction? I don't think there's anything in the Bible that tells us that God's going to protect us from our own sin in that sense, except by accepting the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. So I think it's a big deal, and I think that for me, it's very much a religious matter, because, well, you heard what I think about the beauty of God's creation. I don't want to see that beauty besmirched by what I consider to be sinful activity. Sinful activity, sinful because of the fact that we're not mindful of what it is that we're doing. And I think we're called to be mindful of what we're doing. We're called to be good stewards of the gifts that God has given us. They're not, they're not something that we bought. They're something that's on loan. But you have more to say about that. No. What's to argue about that? I mean, that is right on in respects. Two things. One is we're the only member of the genus Homo that's still standing, and at least one of our predecessors, Homo erectus, lasted almost 2 million years. We've got maybe a couple 100,000 years under our belt as a species. If you just look at the history of human evolution, you wouldn't think that there are any guarantees in this process along the way. That's one thing. The second thing is, while I think that the move from a sense of regency or a sense of authority, kind of humans being tapped by God to dominate and subdue the earth, which is, as you know, is counterbalanced by in the second generation in Genesis story about God placing Adam in the garden to till and keep it. Two very different stories. One I really believe is actually a reflection of the invention of agriculture, which has probably a more powerful event transforming the face of the earth than any other event in human history, and that is the invention of agriculture. Two things. One, it allowed us to proliferate much more powerfully than we had in the past, and it also transformed the face of the earth in ways. But the other so probably than the Industrial Revolution.
But much more so than I think the Industrial Revolution. But the other thing is that while stewardship is a much a better metaphor to use about God's relationship to us and our relationship to nature, what science has given us is, I think, a much more challenging image. And that is to say that we are kin to everything that lives.
Yeah.
Everything that lives is our relative. We may not always get along with our relatives, but they are all related to us by descent. At least that's the story that evolution teaches us. And as a consequence, we can't look at other species, other living creatures on the face of the earth, and see them as somehow a commodity or something that is simply there for for chattel purposes. They're related to us, and frankly, I'm not sure what that means in terms of environmental policy, except that it seems to me that the the divine command that we are to, it says, greater love had no one than he laid down his life for his friends. Well, these aren't just friends; they're family. and so the question is, when Jesus asked the question, "Who is our neighbor?" I mean, it's every living thing that's on the earth. That's our neighbor. So the issue is, how do you think about environmental policy, where you think about these other creatures not as simply objects of economic interest, but as things that are intimately related to us?
Yeah. And it's not just evolution that teaches us that we're all related. Genetics shows us that in real time. Francis Collins, who's the director of the NIH, who is also an evangelical Christian, wrote a book about it called The Language of God. By this he meant the genetic code was the language that God has used to express his creation of life. And it's not just that, we're 98% the same as chimpanzees. We're something like 50% the same as plants. The genetic code is so common. We are intimately connected to all of living creation. And of course, living creation is intimately connected with the inorganic part of creation. This is something, of course, that ecology has taught us. This interrelatedness, and not to take care with that gift of an interrelated world in which we live would be to fail to do what God, I believe, is calling us to do. And I think that more and more we're finding that churches over a wide spectrum are understanding this. Both mainline Protestant churches, Catholic Church, evangelical Protestant churches are understanding that this is part of God's call. And that if we don't respond to God's call, then we're, for one thing, we're guilty, as we all are anyway. But we're in deep trouble.
I should say that in the Presbyterian Church.
Methodists are pretty much along the same lines as that. We just aren't as glum about it.